imagine a nation that launches a new advanced warship every few months. I mean, a nation that boasts the world's second largest economy, a massive industrial base, and a standing military force of, roughly 2 million people.
Yeah, it's an absolute behemoth.
Right. Now, I want you to imagine that all of that immense power, all of that economic leverage could be entirely paralyzed by blocking a single 1.7-mile wide strip of water thousands of miles away from its shores.
It is honestly the ultimate geopolitical paradox because, when we evaluate global superpowers, we instinctively look at their GDP or their technological dominance.
The size of their navy.
Exactly, the navy or their hypersonic missiles. We assume those conventional metrics guarantee security. But this particular vulnerability isn't about a lack of military hardware or economic wealth. It is a vulnerability baked right into the physical map of the world.
And for China, that fundamental geographic weakness is the Indian Ocean. Specifically, the maritime routes that connect it to the energy it desperately needs. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because in this deep dive, we are going to look past the daily headlines and the traditional economic spreadsheet.
Which is so necessary right now.
Yeah. Our goal is to explore this hidden maritime contest, understand the actual geography dictating these power dynamics, and see why the water thousands of miles from Beijing might actually determine the future of Asia.
And that is exactly why this is such a crucial exercise. Because if you want to truly understand how a massive nation operates and survives, you have to look at what physically sustains it.
Right.
Wealth and military might are incredibly impressive, but if your geographic reality is fundamentally compromised, your superpower status remains, exceptionally fragile. You simply cannot digitize the physical shipment of oil.
Wow, yeah. You cannot digitize the shipment of oil.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that physical reality, because to really get this vulnerability, we need to move past the abstract idea of a weakness and look at what is actually floating on the water every single day.
The sheer scale of Chinese logistics is, it's difficult to overstate. We're talking about thousands of commercial vessels traversing the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean continuously.
But thousands of them.
Yes, thousands. These ships are carrying the vast majority of the oil and natural gas that China imports, and that is primarily coming from the Middle East and Africa.
And just to put some numbers to that, because the sources we're looking at highlight this so starkly, China is the world's largest importer of oil. They import over 70% of the oil they consume.
Right, which is staggering.
It is. That is the literal fuel keeping the factories running. It's powering the major coastal cities, keeping the transport networks moving. It requires this continuous, uninterrupted conveyor belt of steel moving across the ocean.
But that conveyor belt cannot just draw a straight line across the globe. The geography of Southeast Asia forces all of that maritime traffic into incredibly tight corridors.
Like a funnel.
Precisely like a funnel. And the most critical of these choke points is the Strait of Malacca, which sits right between Malaysia, Singapore, and the Indonesian island of Sumatra.
Yeah, I was looking at the geographic data from our sources, and at its narrowest point, there's a section called the Phillips Channel. The Strait of Malacca is just about 1.7 miles wide.
Barely wider than a standard airport runway.
Exactly. You have an enormous percentage of a superpower's energy imports threading this tiny needle. It's like looking at a hypermuscular giant that is being forced to breathe through a handful of tiny, easily pinched drinking straws.
That is a great visual. And what's fascinating here is that political scientists and military strategists actually have a specific term for this vulnerability. They call it the Malacca Dilemma.
The Malacca Dilemma.
Right. The dilemma is that raw economic size or, domestic military strength cannot negate absolute reliance on a restrictive, distant maritime route.
It doesn't matter how big you are.
No, it doesn't. If a hostile power blocks that 1.7-mile gap, or even the Strait of Hormuz further west, the giant's muscle just cannot function. You simply cannot buy your way out of a maritime bottleneck.
But wait, let's look at the mechanism here for a second. If China is this recognized military titan, why is it such an unsolvable dilemma? Can't they just send their navy to escort these commercial ships? Because we hear about their rapid naval expansion constantly, right? They have an incredible number of vessels. Why not just guard the route?
It's a logical question, but having a high number of ships near your own coast is very, very different from having what strategists call a blue water navy.
Okay, a blue water navy.
Yes. A blue water navy is a maritime force capable of operating globally, far from its home ports for extended periods of time. Escorting thousands of commercial vessels across the entire expanse of the Indian Ocean requires a massive, continuous logistical chain.
Right, because the warships run out of fuel, too. I mean, they need maintenance.
Exactly. They need friendly ports for refueling, resupplying complex repairs, and all of this thousands of miles from the Chinese coast. Without a comprehensive network of overseas bases throughout the Indian Ocean, projecting that kind of sustained naval power is incredibly difficult.
So they can't just park a ship there.
No, you cannot just send a destroyer out to the Strait of Malacca and tell it to guard the oil indefinitely, not without a supply line to keep that destroyer operational.
Which means whoever controls or, whoever can heavily influence those specific physical choke points holds immense leverage. It completely shifts the balance of power.
It absolutely does.
It's no longer just about who has the biggest overall military. It's about who happens to be sitting right next to the bottleneck.
Precisely. And that realization fundamentally alters how we should view strategic competition in Asia.
Which brings up a glaring question for you, the listener, and honestly, for anyone trying to make sense of global politics right now. If this Malacca dilemma is such an existential threat, I mean, this is the ultimate vulnerability for the world's second largest economy. Why isn't this the main thing we hear about?
It is a great question.
Most geopolitical analysis seems entirely fixated elsewhere.
It is arguably one of the most profound blind spots in popular geopolitical discourse today. The mainstream focus remains almost exclusively locked on the Western Pacific.
Okay, I am going to put up a little bit of a fight on this one. Because calling the Pacific a blind spot feels like we are dismissing the most immediate global realities.
Fair enough. Let's hear it.
Well, the South China Sea and Taiwan are where the actual visible military posturing is happening right now. And frankly, Taiwan produces roughly 60% of the world's semiconductors and over 90% of the most advanced ones.
Very true.
If that supply chain breaks, the global economy crashes practically overnight. So how can a shipping lane in the Indian Ocean possibly trump that immediate catastrophic risk? It really feels like looking away from where the fire is currently burning.
That is a completely fair challenge, and the risk you are describing regarding semiconductors and the global economy is absolutely real. The South China Sea and Taiwan are highly volatile, deeply consequential flashpoints.
Right.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, to understand grand strategy, we have to separate the objective of a conflict from the mechanisms required to fight it.
Okay, walk me through that distinction. How does the mechanism change the priority?
So the Western Pacific is the stage. It is where the political theater, the territorial claims, and the immediate military posturing take place. But the Indian Ocean is the invisible supply line that makes any sustained action on that stage possible.
Oh, I see.
If a major conflict were to erupt in the Pacific, say over Taiwan or disputed islands, how long could China sustain a massive military offensive if its oil and gas imports are entirely severed thousands of miles away?
Oh, wow. So the fist is swinging in the Pacific, but the artery feeding the arm is located in the Indian Ocean.
That is an excellent way to put it. You can have the most advanced military strategy in the world, but modern warfare consumes astronomical amounts of fuel.
Right.
If a rival power pinches the artery at the Strait of Malacca, domestic reserves start draining immediately. The factories building the munitions slow down, the power grid strains, the entire war machine is put on a ticking clock.
You can't put on the play if the theater has no electricity.
Precisely. The Pacific might be where a conflict is visualized and initiated, but the Indian Ocean is where the capacity to sustain that conflict over the long term is actually determined.
Which completely shifts the perspective.
It does. This is why viewing the Pacific in isolation is a strategic mistake. Planners and military strategists know that if things escalate, the first and most devastating asymmetric move an adversary could make wouldn't necessarily be a direct naval clash in the South China Sea.
It would be at the bottleneck.
Yes, it would be a quiet, methodical blockade at those distant choke points.
That completely reframes things. I mean, we get mesmerized by the shiny objects, the hypersonic missiles, the artificial island building, the semiconductor fabs, but grand strategy still relies on the incredibly boring, slow-moving reality of tanker ships.
Always has.
The real long-term shifting of global power happens quietly along those supply lines.
It is about logistics. There's an old saying, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. And when thousands of ships are moving your entire nation's energy supply through a vulnerable ocean, well, that is a defining strategic reality, whether it's leading the evening news or not.
So if China is bottlenecked in the Indian Ocean, the next logical question is, who is holding the bottle? Because the map of the Indian Ocean isn't just open, empty water. It has active players on it.
It certainly does. And the physical geography of the Pacific Ocean has traditionally favored one nation far more than any other.
We are talking about India. And not just because it shares a name with the ocean, but because its physical landmass literally points like a dagger directly at these vital shipping lanes.
Which fundamentally alters the power dynamic in Asia. We live in an era where we often assume technology has conquered geography.
Oh, for sure. We focus on cyber warfare, AI-driven logistics, intertwined global markets.
Exactly. But when you look at India's position on a map, you realize how stubborn physical geography actually is.
Let's look at the specific geography highlighted in the sources, because it is not just the mainland of India that matters here. It is specifically the Andaman and Nicobar Islands.
Yes, absolutely crucial.
For anyone listening who hasn't looked at a map of this region recently, these islands belong to India, and they stretch out in a chain right near the western entrance to the Strait of Malacca.
They are an extraordinary strategic asset. They physically sit right over the primary maritime approach to East Asia.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like setting up a permanent, heavily fortified toll booth right on the single highway that your biggest rival absolutely relies on to survive.
Yes.
You don't even have to leave your front porch to monitor every single truck driving by.
That toll booth analogy captures the dynamic perfectly. India doesn't need to project power thousands of miles away to threaten Chinese supply lines. Those supply lines run directly through India's natural maritime backyard.
Right, through their front yard, essentially.
Exactly. India can base surveillance aircraft, naval vessels, and anti-ship missile systems on those islands, creating a natural blockade capability that is incredibly difficult for an outside power to neutralize.
Which is just the ultimate irony of modern geopolitics.
Right.
We have all this hyper-advanced technology, but this strategic trump card might just boil down to the fact that one country's landmass happens to be sitting in the exact right spot.
It is deeply ironic. However, having the right geography is only the baseline. The sources raise a really critical distinction here.
Okay.
There is a fundamental difference between having a natural geographic advantage and successfully converting it into lasting geopolitical power.
Right. It's the difference between potential energy and kinetic energy. Sitting in the right spot gives you the potential, but you still have to build the engine.
That's spot on. The question becomes, can India modernize its navy fast enough? Can it build out the deep water ports, the runways, and the radar infrastructure on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands to fully leverage that location?
Because just being there isn't enough.
No, because while geography is stubborn, it isn't a substitute for actual capability. The Indian Ocean is massive, and simply being nearby isn't enough to exert control if you lack the platforms and the political will to do so.
And that leads to the inverse question for China. Can this massive economic engine find a way to mitigate the fact that its primary lifeline runs directly past its biggest regional rival?
It's the problem they are constantly trying to solve.
Because as we discussed earlier, you cannot just buy your way out of a maritime bottleneck.
You can't. You cannot build a massive artificial island in the deep, turbulent waters of the Indian Ocean the way you might in the shallow South China Sea.
Right.
You cannot simply invent a new ocean to sail your oil tankers through. The most consequential strategic competition between India and China is playing out far from the Pacific precisely because it is an unavoidable geographic trap.
It is a slow, methodical game of chess where the board itself is physically tilted.
Yes. China has the sheer economic weight, the larger overall naval numbers, and a massive industrial capacity. But India holds the natural geographic high ground in the exact theater where China is most fundamentally vulnerable.
So, to bring all these threads together for you listening, the traditional way we measure a superpower, by looking at GDP, tech dominance, or the size of a standing army, it really misses a massive piece of the puzzle.
It misses the physical foundation.
Right. The world's second largest economy is tethered to a vulnerable 1.7-mile-wide geographic bottleneck called the Strait of Malacca. The flashpoints in the Pacific, like Taiwan, might dominate our news feeds, but those are just the visible stage.
The theater, as we said.
Exactly. The invisible supply line, the artery that actually sustains that power, runs right through the Indian Ocean. And in that specific theater, India holds a natural physical advantage that no amount of money can easily erase.
Which should fundamentally change how you consume the news moving forward.
Absolutely.
The next time you see a headline about a new aircraft carrier being launched in the Pacific, or tensions flaring over semiconductor supply chains, you now have the context to look deeper.
You can ask the ultimate logistical question. Yes, but what about the ships?
Exactly. You can look past the immediate political posturing and consider the literal maritime geography making any of that power projection possible. Because behind every story of global economic dominance is a physical tanker ship carrying physical oil, hoping it can safely pass through a very narrow, very vulnerable choke point.
It really grounds all of these abstract geopolitical concepts into a tangible physical reality. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over. Something to explore on your own that builds on everything we've just uncovered.
Let's hear it.
We've established that the Malacca Dilemma and the geography of the Indian Ocean pose an existential threat to China's status as a superpower. The giant is breathing through the pinched straw, and the toll booth is heavily guarded.
Right.
If dominating that water is simply too geographically risky and building a global blue water navy takes decades, might their ultimate long-term survival strategy involve trying to bypass the oceans altogether?
Oh, that is the billion-dollar question.
Could the future of this strategic contest be defined not by who dominates the water, but by finding ways to make the Indian Ocean completely obsolete? We are talking about engineering massive new overland rail and pipeline routes straight through Central Asia, or developing entirely new domestic energy sources that don't need to be shipped on a tanker at all. Because if the giant knows it cannot rely on that tiny straw forever, eventually it's going to have to engineer a completely new way to breathe.
Thank you for joining us on this Strategic Vanguard podcast. If you found value in this analysis, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you fresh podcasts every Monday here on YouTube and Rumble, and you can also catch the audio versions on Spotify and Amazon Music. Just search for Strategic Vanguard Podcast. For more insights, articles, and discussions, subscribe to our blog at strategicvanguard.com. Your support helps us grow and bring you more in-depth analysis on defense, geopolitics, and strategy. Until next time, stay informed, stay strategic.